Good evening. Welcome to the ARCO Forum. I'm John White, the director of the Center for Business and Government. The center, as many of you know, is dedicated to the notion that of all the issues out there, many of them directly impact both public and private sector activities, and therefore there ought to be a business and private sector voice in dealing with those problems. We find this, I think, particularly important in an era in which we are re-examining a whole set of our institutions, from health care to welfare to defense to pension policy and so on. But I think most importantly, there is an overarching challenge to the country in this regard, and it has to do with the economic and fiscal integrity of our system as we go forward. And I think it's never been more serious in our history. And our guest tonight has a career that exemplifies the commitment to working in both sectors and to speaking out on these important issues. Pete Peterson is a summa cum laude graduate of Northwestern and an honors graduate of the Business School at the University of Chicago, where he was also on the faculty. He's the author of Facing Up: How to Rescue the Economy from Crushing Debt and Restore the American Dream, and co-author of On Borrowed Time: How the Growth in Entitlement Spending Threatens America's Future. In public service, he has served in the cabinet in the soon-to-be-abolished Commerce Department, as well as an assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs, served on numerous national boards and commissions, including being chairman of the National Commission on Productivity and chairman of the Quadrennial Commission on Executive, Legislative, and Judicial Pay. In his business career, he's held positions as chairman and CEO at Lehman Brothers and as president of Bell & Howell, and he is currently chairman of the Blackstone Group, a private bank which he founded in 1985. Most recently, over the past several years, as I have gotten to know him, his energies have been focused very effectively on the economic future of this country and our responsibilities for future generations of Americans. He's a founder of the Concord Coalition, where he is the founding president, and where I am pleased to say I am the vice chairman. The co-chairs are Paul Tsongas and Warren Rudman. And most recently, in his continuing crusade to make Americans aware of these problems, Pete has served as a member of the National Bipartisan Commission on Entitlements and Tax Reform, chaired by Senators Kerry and Jack Danforth. And it is in this most recent work that he will talk tonight, and it couldn't be more timely or more important. So I'm pleased to welcome Pete Peterson as our guest here this evening. Thank you. Pete?
Thank you very much. Is it appropriate for me to say thank you, Mr. Secretary?
Yes.
Okay. I think it was a little unkind for you to refer to the Commerce Department in that way. I wouldn't have said that about the Defense Department. And we always thought the two departments were roughly equivalent. John, seriously, I want to thank you for all your support of the Concord Coalition, both substantive and moral, and I don't know how we've done what we did without you. I've been making talks now for longer than I care to remember, and I often have the following experience. Someone will say to me on the street, "Mr. Peterson, that was a memorable speech that I heard you give." And as an original market researcher out of college, I'm indiscreet enough to ask them precisely what they remember. And there's inevitably a very long pause, very painful, and all that anyone has ever remembered is some joke that I have told. So I have decided that to invoke not the Peter principle, but the Peterson principle, which is, if you're going to give a talk, embellish it with some jokes that are roughly relevant to whatever you're talking about, and perhaps something will stick to their bones. So in that spirit, I have a couple of quick stories to tell you. Recently, Ted Sorensen, who many of you will recall was President Kennedy's gifted assistant, introduced me in the following way. He said, Peterson and I were on an airplane to the Mideast, and shortly before the plane landed, two terrorists leapt out of their seats with machine guns and said, we're going to assassinate these two former public officials on a thoroughly bipartisan basis, but we're going to give each of them their last wish. So they go up to Peterson and say, well, Peterson, what's your last wish? And Peterson says, well, I have one last speech I want to give to the people on the airplane about the relationship between entitlement spending and the federal deficit. They then go to Sorensen and say, all right, Sorensen, you've heard Peterson, what's your last wish? And he said, well, in view of what you've heard from Peterson, my last wish is to be shot first. So try to remember that, if you will. My dear friend Steve Fenster is here, and he knows that our colleagues at the Blackstone Group, particularly our younger colleagues, store up their hostility for a year to the partners, and then on the occasion of the Christmas party, we give them a few hours of relative freedom to say what they will, and all of this unresolved hostility pours out. So the last Christmas party after my book came out, they play a game called Karnak that you'll remember that Johnny Carson played, and here are the answers. What are the questions? Well, the answers in the case of Peterson were 100,000, 99,000, 1, and 0. What are the questions? Well, the questions were, how many books did he print? Then how many books did he sign and give away? And then how many were bought? And then, of course, how many were read? So that gives you some idea of what I put up with, but that doesn't stop me at all in my inevitable journey to boredom. But I'm going to take a slightly different tack today. I've had two recent experiences I should share with you that illustrate the immense cultural and political difficulties of doing anything about entitlement reform. As John indicated, I was on the President's Commission chaired by Bob Kerrey and Jack Danforth. And since the election was in November and everybody knew that they wanted to avoid the turkey shoot phenomenon, where you lift your head with some idea and you get shot off, we decided that we'd put out a report on the problems, on the nature of the problems. The report came out, and much to my amazement, Kerrey and Danforth got the 20 senators and congressmen, bipartisan, on this commission to sign a report that was about 80% as far as I would have gone, which is quite a ways, I would say. And among the things this report said was that the problem of funding entitlements in the next century was unsustainable, and they said that in unambiguous language with all sorts of examples, the percent of the GNP and so forth, that would have to go to support them. However, and it's a big however, when the time came to present the reform suggestions, so to gird their political loins, as it were, to propose specific reforms, the number who were willing to advocate specific reforms to solve a problem that they had earlier said was unsustainable dwindled to a very precious few, including, of course, our co-chairman. About 2 weeks ago, I wrote a piece for the Sunday New York Times, and this response illustrates another point. I find in my business when you write these rather provocative and unpalatable pieces, you get a flood of mail, and the mail that is the most scatological is that comes on yellow-lined pages written with big letters. And the minute my office sees this, oh, Mr. Peterson, here comes some more of those. And, of course, they blasted me as a mean-spirited, rich, fat cat Wall Streeter, which to most of them was the ultimate redundancy, I'm sure. And some of their other characterizations, as I say, were a bit more scatological. Now, what is evidence as you read these letters is there's kind of a Pavlovian paranoia out there that the mere mention of reform of something like Social Security is translated quickly in, oh, that SOB is trying to get rid of it. Now, what did I really say? And I reread it to be sure. I'm about to show you some charts that will show you these numbers, but let me briefly summarize it. I said that the size of the annual deficits from the Social Security and the Medicare system were so vast as to be totally unfinanceable. And if you tried to fund them with tax increases, they would have been unsustainable. And therefore, this left the third option, the very distinct possibility that those Americans who needed Social Security the most would suddenly and draconianly find their safety net yanked away. I even went on to make the point, to be sure everybody understood, that I do think there's a very important humane aspect to this, that over half of the Social Security retirees today make less than $20,000, and over half of what they make comes from Social Security. So I urge that if you're going to avoid this truly mean-spirited, draconian solution, it was important to start taking a more gradual and humane approach, including something I call the affluence test, that reduces benefits progressively for those with above average incomes, so that those at one level might lose 5 or 10%, and the Pete Petersons of the world would lose 85% of their benefits. And I talked about increasing the retirement age and so forth. But I did this in the spirit that it was one important way to maintain the existence of a valid safety net for those who needed it. But the myths and the ignorance and the fear are so great that anybody that is in the business of reforming this system has to deal with this kind of Pavlovian paranoia, and it makes constructive dialogue particularly difficult. So those of us who are Johnny One-Notes, or I should probably say Peter One-Notes, will need to try a variety of tacks. And tonight what I'd like to do is to put entitlement reform in a somewhat broader and I think deeper context, not my usual terrain of budgets and deficits and taxes and benefits. Rather, what kind of a society are we going to become, and what kind of a country are we going to become as we come to understand that demography is indeed destiny? In the last political campaign, President Clinton, you recall, said it's the economy, stupid. And I would like to argue this evening that in future campaigns, it's more likely to be it's demographics, stupid. And my basic thesis this evening is that this country has only a skin-deep appreciation of the profound demographic forces that are already evident. We know there are those baby boomers, but we're not even sure they take themselves seriously. And we're not at all sure how many of them there are, except you've heard there are more. Now, I was one of those unfortunate few that was presumably educated at the University of Chicago, and we had a Nobel Prize winner there. I make that point, John, to indicate that we had our full share of Nobel Prize winners. Jake Viner, who one day said, a transition period is but a period between two other transition periods. And I'd like to argue that the demographic map of America is not a transition, that it's a transformation. And it will affect not only our budgets and our deficits, but will affect our culture, our society, our values, and our politics. I was once taught that large differences in degree can make a difference in kind, and that indeed to me is the question. What kind of a society will we have, and what must we address? So I'm not going to subject you this evening to the Peterson full court press on 20 reforms. We can discuss those if you will, but focus more on the demographics that are going to give new meaning to the term unsustainability. I was in the Nixon administration, and I know there are some of you here that believe that a Nixon humorist is truly an oxymoron, but we had one in the form of Herbert Stein, who said one day, if something's unsustainable, it tends to stop. In other words, you cannot sustain the unsustainable. If you don't like that, there's another one we used. If your horse dies, we suggest you dismount. Now, if we're going to grasp in our gut rather than just in statistics what is meant by unsustainability, we must demythologize the notion, and there are a number of them, that somehow people assume that their money has been, quote, saved in their behalf, when in fact it's never been saved at all. We are on a pay-as-you-go system, obviously. We must somehow educate the American people that the trust fund is truly a fiscal oxymoron. It's a travesty on the word trust, and the only thing in the trust funds is a bunch of government bonds. Now, I'm going to show you some charts, and I don't expect you to adjust them because they're pretty unpalatable. And those of you that are suffering from terminal insomnia, I will be glad to make them available to you if you're interested. So now for a little change of pace, I'd like to show you a few charts. I'll try to make this as painless as possible. Thank God this is an Eastman Kodak projector. If it doesn't work, I can blame them and not Bell and Howell. So let's, this first chart, for those of you who can't see it, is intended to show that since 1980, and this has been a baby dearth or a baby bust, a very benign era demographically, the programs other than entitlements, defense, and interest have actually gone down by $63 billion. And John, you know, the Reagan-Bush defense budgets were endlessly blamed for our problems. Well, in fact, the entitlement programs have grown 3 times faster than did the defense budget during this unusually benign period. Now, what's also interesting is how many people are now willing to continue to focus their efforts on the right-hand side of that chart, where there already had been significant reductions in real terms. Now, so much of the recent talk has been about welfare reform, and who could argue that welfare should be reformed? Obviously, it must be for fiscal and societal reasons. But I think in the course of emphasizing welfare reform so much, we might give people the idea that welfare meets the Willie Sutton factor. You know, why does he rob banks? That's where the money is, he said. Well, that's not where the money is, and it's extremely important that the American people understand that. And to make this a little more vivid, what I decided to do, John, was to show the number of people, the growth in the number of people receiving AFDC and OASDI between 1970 and 1995 was 7.1 million. The increased number of Social Security recipients in the equivalent period between 1995 and 2020 is 24.6 million. But this is heavily aggravated by the fact that the per capita benefit that goes to the welfare person is 1/10 what the per capita benefit is on the Social Security side of things. So that if you look at aggregate dollars, which we must, you see a 40-time difference in importance in total dollars, $6 billion versus $240 billion. Now, if Willie Sutton were confronted with these facts, I think what he would say is, well, we better focus on the vast so-called non-mean-tested entitlements. And let me just take a moment to talk about the politics for the moment of avoiding this delicate political issue. And the Concord Coalition, as John knows, I think you're a sensible Democrat if there is such a thing, aren't you? Yes, I guess you are. We're thoroughly bipartisan, so I will attack both parties with equal passion, I hope. First, you have Ronald Reagan, who came upon the scene, and if one were to believe what he seemed to be saying, the music as well as the lyrics, it was those vodka-drinking, mink-wearing, Cadillac-driving welfare queens who were responsible for our problems, and if we could somehow take care of that, we would have solved our fiscal problems. Now, Bill Clinton comes along and says, in effect, no, Ronald Reagan had it wrong, it's at the other end, it's the rich, and if we could just somehow get those fat cats Somehow that'll solve the problem. Disregarding the fact that if you took all of the benefits away from those receiving, making more than $200,000, it's only $5 billion. Now, everyone tells me that entitlement reform is the third rail of American politics. I would like to argue tonight that there's a deeper third rail, which is this notion in our land that the broad middle class is not part of the problem, and therefore they don't have to be part of the solution. And this tendency in America to victimize the broad middle class, which is still one of the richest in the world, is, in my opinion, the real third rail of American politics. To wit, our president's immense emphasis on a new set of rights for the middle class, as you know. Now, let me just show you what the numbers are on annual deficits, then I'll get to the demographics. This is the annual budget deficit from Social Security, and this is how it grows. There's a slight surplus now. In the year 2025, we're looking at an annual deficit of $478 billion, which is, of course, what needs to be financed. You can see that by the year 2040, and many of these people are already born, it reaches just astronomical levels, approaching $1.5 trillion a year. Now, are those that say that we're not going to keep Social Security off the table, but we're going to keep Medicare off the table?
You went ahead. Just click back.
Oh, I went ahead of myself. Right. Is this Medicare?
That's Medicare.
Yeah. The Medicare deficit in the same year is now projected to be $758 billion. If you add those two together, and I can ask my friend Steve the reaction of the financial markets to a mere $1.2 trillion increase. It's really more than that because it's surplus now, and trying to finance that. The mere mention of it to a bond trader is enough to give them a serious set of terminal hives. Now, some of my friends say, well, the Concord Coalition, White and Peterson, don't really understand this. And what they've got to do is understand that all these programs are like a pension plan, and they ought to be looked at in an actuarial way. So, John, I've gone to the OMB and elsewhere, and I've gotten the numbers on the unfunded liabilities, which is the way we tend to look at them, of course, in industry. Now, the unfunded liabilities, of course, are the promises that have been made to today's adults in excess of the assets plus the future taxes that are required, that are now on the books for people to pay. I'm glad you haven't had dinner yet, because these are the numbers of the unfunded liabilities. They total for the entitlement programs $14.4 trillion, roughly 3 times the size of the public debt that the country knows about. Now, the difference between those two, if we're going to maintain the benefit levels, obviously requires huge increases in taxes that I'll show you in a moment, or huge financing that I believe are unsustainable. I've been wanting John to write a book called Beyond Chutzpah, and it's going to be a very thick book, alas. One of the true Beyond Chutzpah items on there is a mere $1.4 trillion for unfunded liabilities for the federal pensions. Now, keep in mind that the same congressmen who say to us that they are deeply alarmed and concerned about the unfunded pensions for all of the private workers in America, that equal $71 billion, are quite benign about unfunded liabilities 20 times that large for a much smaller population of workers. And I asked the people that do my research, if we simply said to the Congress, we're going to take you seriously, you say you want to be treated the way other people are treated, suppose that we insisted that the federal government funded its pensions on the same 30-year basis as ERISA requires pensions to be funded. It would only add $90 billion a year to the annual deficit. So it is those vast unfunded liabilities that, of course, help us define the enormity of the problem and lead to the next chart. Because if we're going to go on a pay-as-you-go basis, let's look at the taxes that would be required. As you can see here, we're currently paying about 10.7% of payroll. And I've given you two estimates because the government uses the so-called intermediate projection, which has nearly always been optimistic. And I've also shown you the so-called high cost projection, which tends to be a little closer to reality. But the point is, whether you take one estimate or the others, we're looking at somewhere between a 60% and over 100% increase in the payroll tax just for Social Security without Medicare. Now keep in mind, for the majority of Americans, their payroll taxes are already larger than their income taxes. So to my supply side friends, who've never met a tax increase they like, and who are revolted by the idea of an increase in income taxes, many of them are showing a rather benign attitude toward this kind of massive increase in the taxes of the very middle class that everybody says they are out there to protect. Now, if you add Medicare to this, you literally go off the chart, where there's somewhere between 37.9% of payroll and 61% of payroll. Now, our children and grandchildren cannot, will not, and should not pay that level of taxes, and our economy could not sustain it. And I don't give you these projections because I think they're going to happen, because I agree with Herb's sign. Something this unsustainable is going to stop. The question before us is, under what circumstances will it stop? Now let me get to the demographics part of all this and show you some of the reasons, for those of you who don't study these things, that this case emerges. Now the first force is, of course, the fact that we're living much longer than we used to. We're still pretending in the Social Security system that we're more or less like we were in 1935, where someone age 65 lived about 12.6 years. In 1993, they were living 17.2 years, nearly 5 years longer. And as you can see in the other two cases, by 2040, it's somewhere between 19 and 21 years, and this is without an overwhelming new biological or some other breakthrough. So we're looking at a 52 to 68% increase since 1935. Now, to make life more interesting, we have come to expect to retire earlier, and it makes no difference what age group you're talking about, 55, 65, 70, and over. We're retiring much younger than we used to. And part of the American ethos has become that we're all entitled to, the golden years, and the longer, the better. Now, the third phenomenon, of course, is the lower birth rates that we're experiencing versus what we experienced during the baby boom period. And this, of course, means fewer taxpayers. To give you some notion of the extraordinary implication of the big bump of the baby boomers, what I did was to take the 19 years before that and compared it to the 19 years of the baby boomers, basically from 1946 to 64. You might be interested in knowing that in the previous 19 years, there were 49.6 million born. But in those baby boomer years, there was more than a 50% increase, or 75.6 million. Now, if you look at the projections into the future, there are those who say, well, maybe the birth rate's going to go up. But there's a phenomenon we're seeing all over the industrial world with working mothers and single mothers and marrying late and so forth. Even the so-called optimistic projection shows very little likelihood of an increase in the birth rate, and the intermediate projection shows a decrease. Now, as a result of this, the elderly population is going to grow much faster than is the younger working generation. If you just look at the chart on the left, the 119% are the recipients, and the 25% are those who are paying the taxes, you see. And just to give you an idea of how the combination of those born plus living longer, from 1992 to 2040, it is now estimated that the number of elderly in America will grow from 39 to 45 million. Now that's the equivalent of a population increase of all of California plus all of the New England states. Just the increase now in over the age 65. Now, to give you something that's a little more identifiable, I decided, since we've all been to Florida every once in a while, to take Florida as a reference point because we have a visual image of this. And the population in Florida over the age of 65 is now 18.6%. You can see that in the year 2020 we pass that point so that we become a nation of Floridas. And by the current projection, even though we don't have the benefits of living there, alas, and in the out years, by both scenarios, we are substantially more senior in our composition as a nation than we're now exhibiting in Florida. Now, this gives rise to the well-known phenomenon where the taxpayer workers supporting each beneficiary drops dramatically. It started in 1960 at 5 workers. It's now 3.2, and the estimates are somewhere between 1.6 and 2 workers supporting each beneficiary, which of course is one of the factors leading to the huge increase in taxes. Now, another demographic phenomenon that I don't think the American people are yet fully aware of is the so-called explosion of the old, those over 85. Now, the next chart shows you the percentage growth in each of the categories. The first 65 to 74, the next 75 to 84, the next 85 and over. And you can see that even the conservative assumption has the over 85s growing by 230%, the less optimistic by 316%. Now, to give us an idea of what this means in actual numbers, from 1992 to 2040, it is now estimated that the number of Americans aged 85 and over will grow by somewhere between 8 and 11 million. So in other words, imagine a New York City area, composed entirely of the increased number of over 85-year-olds. And with the low birth rates that are predicted in all of the scenarios, we could actually foresee a time when there will be more people over 85 than children under the age of 5, just to give us another image of what the country might look like. Now, the fact that we have this aging of the aged phenomenon, it accelerates greatly the final or fourth force on entitlement explosion, the soaring health care costs. It is vaguely appreciated, but not widely enough, that the over 85-year-old person consumes on average about $5,000 per capita, whereas the 65 to 69-year-old only $2,000. And this is one of the phenomenon that is driving health care costs and will drive them substantially. Now, I know, John, that the Kennedy School deals with the political economy, so I would be, in this flood of charts, it would be wrong if I did not at least speculate a bit on the political aspects of this demographic explosion. The first chart shows you the well-known fact that the elderly vote much more than do the young people. For example, at the present time, the elderly are 12.6% of the population, but in terms of percent of actual voters, they're 20.2%. So I did a little extrapolation and said, what might the voting population look like if the elderly continued to vote in the same ratios as they do now? At the present time, voters under age 35 outnumber the voters over 65 by about a third. But if the current ratios continue, you could see a situation where, as you can see here, the elderly would outnumber all young voters under 35 by about 2/3, and we'll spend a minute or two discussing that. All right, now, thank God, I'm sure you'd say that's all the charts you're going to see. And let me turn the projector off. And now let me just raise a series of questions with you. about this transformation business, because I think it's going to require some transformational thinking in America to deal with this. Let's start with one transformation. These trends that I'm discussing with you are in the nature of a rather silent, slow phenomenon or crisis. It'll take 15 years before they really begin reflecting themselves in a highly visible way. Now that 15 years, just to give us a sense of time, is about the time Ronald Reagan took over, just to give us a sense of what we're talking about. But of course America deals with the immediate moment, the short term, and we leave the future to someone else. So one of the transformational questions that I think the Kennedy School might want to look at is, absent a terminal crisis of some sort, how and indeed can we get the American people to focus on a problem that may take a decade before the symptoms really start appearing? All right, there's another transformation that I think needs to be focused on. And incidentally, I don't claim to have the answers. I'm not even sure I have the right questions, but I do know we'd better start discussing the new questions. There's certainly going to be a retirement transformation. We all consider now 65 or earlier to be the retirement age, and most baby boomers tell everyone that's when they expect to retire. But if we can't afford, at least publicly, to support these long lifespans, what should we change the age of retirement to? Should it be 68? Should it be 70, 72? And when are we going to tell those people whose retirement plans I think are going to have to change that the change is coming? One of the draconian aspects of waiting too late to cut the benefits is that, of course, it doesn't give the elderly the time and the opportunity to build their private savings. So I would think those who argue for humaneness and a gradual approach would be sympathetic to an approach that gives people as much time as possible to plan for a realistic future. There are economics, labor economics questions. How are the economy and employers going to adapt to keep so many seniors in the workforce if indeed they are not going to retire when they do? What are we going to do about the perverse incentives that we have in our tax system these days that actually discourage people from re-entering the workforce? And many of those, as you know, were set up in the Depression period. And what jobs are appropriate for seniors who continue working, and how do we maximize their productivity and their availability? And this, John, is where I think some sociologists and psychologists are needed. What we really need, it seems to me, is a far more active and positive vision of aging, a vision of elderly more or less being reborn again into a new and active and a rewarding phase of their lives, rather than the image that we have today. A second transformation is in consumption and savings. If the public savings aren't going to be there to provide for the retirement needs of the boomers, how do we stimulate private savings? And how can we do so in view of the discouraging trends in which national savings have fallen dramatically over the last quarter century? Some say it's easy. I'm not at all sure it's easy at all. I chaired a commission on capital formation on the Competitiveness Policy Council, and I gathered together the best savings economists I could find from one coast to the other. And one thing was pretty clear. The evidence of the effect of tax incentives, the net effect of tax incentives on savings, is quite ambiguous when you consider the cost of providing those incentives. So let's go through some possibilities. Some will say, well, why don't we rely more on pensions? Well, as we do that, let's think of certain facts. Only about half of the Americans today have any private pension. And the number, alas, is falling, not rising. And the half without pensions tend to be the poorest half. And there are some who say, well, let's just mandate that all businesses must provide pensions for their employees, and that way contribute a solid base of private savings. That would certainly raise the savings rate. But do we remember the last go-around we had on mandating health care for those businesses and the outrage that took place at that time? Now, Senator Kerry and Danforth have suggested an imaginative idea, at least I think imaginative conceptually. They said, why don't we take part of the FICA payroll tax, 1.5%, and put it into a funded, portable private plan. That way the young workers will know it's there and it'll encourage their notion of saving. Well, it's a very interesting idea, but we already have a huge burden to deal with. And clearly, if some of the money that was going to go to fund those plans is no longer available, it adds greatly to the so-called transitional problems. I think it's time to realize, and the American people at the present time have more or less been led to believe that they have a moral duty to consume more because the economy depends on it, that we consume far more than any industrial country in the world. And I think there is the vision that's totally inaccurate that America has always been these big borrowers and consumers. Any rational reading of economic history tells us that up until the Second World War, we were the largest savers and investors in the world. So whatever's been going on has taken place over the last 40 years. You'll recall that because the rest of the world, industrial world, was in a sense in ashes, and our capital plant was in great shape from the war, we developed a tax system that essentially encouraged people to consume and borrow, and the rest of the world had to rebuild their capital stocks, so they built a system to encourage savings and capital. We, for example, made interest payments deductible. We made mortgage interest deductible. We put the highest tax of all on what we called unearned income, namely income from savings. The rest of the world thought we were crazy, saying the hardest savings of all to earn is the earnings from savings. But whatever it is, we set up an incentive system that encouraged consumption. We then have an advertising world that's been built up, aimed at children from the time they are young children. My wife, as Steve and Karen knows, is the mother of Big Bird, the founder of Children's Television Workshop. And she is just alarmed at the differences in our culture with regard to advertising to children here versus the rest of the world. Under our notion of total freedom of communication, our children, and I'm sure those of you who have children have seen them bombarded on Saturday mornings and all, with a simple message, buy now and save later, which means usually never. And so there's a whole set of cultural forces here that have led us to be the high consumption society. To me, a fascinating question is, how does one go about engineering this transformation? I think there's going to be a kind of an ethical transformation that needs to be discussed. And I know how convincingly that comes from an investment banker, but you have a divinity school here, so you can go there for guidance. Let me take one example. How are our ethical views going to change about the most fundamental issues of life and death? Every study that I have seen shows that America spends an unprecedented portion of our skyrocketing health care costs on the last few months of life. And many would argue that much of these costs are heroic intervention that in many cases prolong death more than they prolong life. What are going to be the dynamics of this situation when we have 3 or 4 times as many of these over 85 years old? What are the politics going to be at a time when you have 3 or 4 times as many families, by definition, who are dealing with this problem than are dealing with now? At another level, I think there's going to be an ethical, at least, look at the relationship between parents and their children, like speaking the truth, for example, to your own children, like the endowment ethic, not the entitlement ethic. Like many, I'm the most lucky beneficiary of immigrant parents who brought to America the endowment ethic, not the entitlement ethic, but the endowment ethic. So I think the whole question of the relationship and the responsibilities of parents and children will be an important one. Another transformation is the productivity education transformation. it seems obvious to me that if we're just going to rely on 1.6 to 2 workers to support every retiree, we're going to want these workers to be the most productive, best educated, highly skilled in the world. That, as an abstraction, is the case. But how are we going to square that with what's been going on in the last few hours, days, months, and years, in which we see the proportions of money being spent on children in terms of Head Start and education and training falling relative to the massive expenditures that are being spent on elderly, which are obviously consumption, not investment. Even in communities, we're beginning to see huge battles, as Harvard educators know, between young families with children in the schools and a powerful lobby of property tax paying seniors whose children have already graduated. So while we can agree in the abstract that we should invest more in the productivity of our young people, a fascinating question, John, is how do we go about managing such a transformation given the cultural attitudes that exist? Then I would argue there are transformations in the global economy. As all of you probably know, all of the developed world are facing similar demographic trends to these. So I'll just give you some questions to ponder. Will the foreign capital from Japan and Europe, on which we have so relied to finance our various deficits, begin to dry up as these societies require more of their savings to stay at home to support their own aging populations? On my last trip to Japan, I met with the Alan Greenspan of Japan, Governor Miyano of the Bank of Japan, and I was conveying the conventional wisdom in America that Japan should stimulate their economy and become more consumption-oriented to stimulate imports. And Mr. Miyano looked at me and said, Mr. Peterson, I've read some of your material, and he said, I'm quite affected by it, which made me suspicious to begin with, but it was a nice introduction. He said, you know, our society is aging too, and we feel we should be saving more, not less, in order to provide for our elderly. So a very interesting question is going to emerge as to what the availability of capital is going to be, what the prices of capital can be, as the entire industrial world begins to age. I almost hate to get into this one because it might cost some of us a lot of money. There might be some transformational changes in our view of inheritance, and I don't really know how this is going to work out. But in the interest of balance, it's estimated that about $10 trillion is going to be passed from today's senior citizens to today's baby boomers. Now, given our fiscal problems, is it possible there will be a strong political tendency to look covetously on taxing these transfers at even higher rates? But then what will that do to the incentives longer term we want to increase private savings? And to make John White uneasy as he contemplates his defense position, maybe as our budgeteers start grasping desperately for resources, everything's going to be subjected to zero-based budgeting. And the defense budget is clearly one of the large pools of resources, still $270 billion. I have a feeling, John, you ain't seen nothing yet as these pressures mount. And if that happens, what are its implications on America's role as a superpower? Will there be an immigrant transformation? And I know what a hot potato this is, but the median age of the newly arrived immigrant in the United States is about 10 years younger than the median age of the U.S. population. Now, for that reason, it'll be very tempting, I suspect, to import a lot of immigrants to pay the taxes so that the money's around. Indeed, the trustees of Social Security are projecting some increase. But how is that going to square with the strong and increasingly virulent public sentiment directed against immigrants? And we all know what happened in Germany when they imported foreign guest workers to make up for the low fertility rate and to see some of the explosive issues that raised. What about a political transformation? With the senior citizens increasingly large and with seniors traditionally tending to be represented by extremely powerful lobbies, I'm proud to say that I'm near the top of the hit list of the AARP, and that's a badge of honor as far as I'm concerned. And they vote in disproportionate numbers compared to the youth. And with this particular group of baby boomers, seniors to be, who are known for their self-absorption, if not their downright self-centered outlook, are we headed toward even more political hegemony of the senior bloc? Or will the youth, who will be working for tomorrow's senior benefits, wake up to this dilemma while there's still time to do something about it? Now, if you look in the rest of the world that's been aging, you find some provocative proposals that are distinctly un-American, but you will get some idea of how far people are willing to go. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, for example, has suggested that younger people be given a double-weighted vote in elections in order to make up for the demographic deficit that they face vis-a-vis retirees. His second equally interesting proposal is that the indigent elderly should be encouraged to sue their children for support before they are allowed to collect benefits from the state. How do you think that's going to sell in America? And are we headed, as Paul Tsongas says we might, toward an intergenerational war? We can all hope not. Now, I ask you these questions not because I know the answers, but because I don't. But because I think an institution like this one needs to focus on helping provide the answers. I was thinking, John, coming up here, about the rather sad and bitter debate about the Vietnam War and Bob McNamara, which I know you know. And the debate about not only who said what and who did what and when did they know it and what could they have done to change the course of history. I think in some ways we're at a similar transformational point. And if we don't face up to the realities of our aging societies, the casualties could be very high indeed. If we do, however, the basis exists to define the American prospect and the American dream, to redefine it, and for this wonderfully resilient and resourceful nation to reinvent itself in the crucible of one of civilization's most challenging problems: how to balance the interests of young and old, how to respect and benefit from the contribution of elders and their children, and how to achieve the personal gains from increased longevity without putting undue burdens on the future. So I'd like to leave you with two thoughts. First, because this problem is a bit off in the future, it is, forgive the expression, academic problem. And precisely because these issues are so interdisciplinary, if I can still use that word, isn't this set of issues that are raised about the aging of America precisely the kind of issues that great universities should address in a very forthright way? Think about it. They're fiscal issues, they're economic issues, they're philosophic issues, they're global issues, they're historical issues, they're sociological issues, they're psychological issues, and they are moral issues, and finally, they are political issues. Now, because of all these sophisticated issues, and because they are so interrelated, isn't this the kind of project that a great school like the Kennedy School and a unique school like Harvard should engage? Let me close on this note. Paul Tsongas has said that it's not enough that our children love us. We would also hope that they respect us. So I would say to you today, in the years 2010 and beyond, when our children and grandchildren come to us and ask us, where were you when you knew this was coming? And I take pleasure in the fact that John and I and those of us in the Concord Coalition can say, and I hope you can too, we were there for you. We were there alerting to the country to the need for gradual and humane changes that should be made. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete, very much. I must say I am reminded of the couple traveling across the Great Plains of the West who came upon a herd of buffalo, stopped the car and got out and took a look, and man turned to his wife and said, "Mabel, those are the ugliest, dirtiest, dumbest looking beasts I've ever seen." Got back in the car and drove away, and one buffalo turned to the other and said, "You know, I think I just heard a discouraging word." We have time for questions. I would ask you please to limit your questions to one each so that we can get in as many as we possible, since we don't have much time. Yes, sir.
My name is Steve Wardell. I'm a senior at the college, and I've read your work and admire your work, Mr. Peterson.
When you say at the college, you mean the University of Chicago?
No, Harvard College. And I have a question. In the upcoming political debate about entitlements and non-means-tested middle-class entitlements, do you think that will be fought in economic terms or in moral terms? Do you think that an argument might be that it is immoral to seek or to have an entitlement, especially if you don't need it? And also, for someone like myself who's growing up and paying Social Security, do you think there'll be a chance that it'll ever become voluntary? Social Security will ever become voluntary?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I can speak directly to the young, because you're part of the problem, there's a wonderful study that's been done by the Committee for Economic Development. If you haven't read it, I urge many of you to read it, called "Who Pays for Retirement?" And in that study, they recount the following facts. First, that less than a third of the young people under 35 have a pension, which is smaller than it's ever been. Their savings rate is at all times low. And there's a recent survey that has been done by a group that we're supporting called the Third Millennium, that twice as many young people believe in UFOs as believe that they're going to get their Social Security. Now, since those are three of the principal legs of retirement, one of the things going to have to happen is the young people are going to have to start confronting the future, as unlikely or unpalatable as that might be. And when they do, I think that'll help energize them, at least intellectually, to face these issues. Now, it's interesting that you should raise the moral question, because I think that argument ultimately will be as important as any argument. But I think, lest I be accused of granny bashing, let me tell you an experience that I had on 60 Minutes. When they decided to review my book, Leslie Stahl said, "You're going to have to confront the elderly." That's a fairly daunting task for those of you who haven't done it. And I travel out to Connecticut, and here's about 100 elderly, average age about 75, glowering at me. And I decided to show them blown-up pictures of my grandchildren. And I told them we'd each have equal time to discuss our grandchildren, but that was really what this was all about. And I saw something remarkably encouraging in that experience. When they understood that basically they weren't getting back their money, most of them were getting back far more, in case of Medicare, 10 to 20 times more than they did tax-free. When they understood that the taxes they were paying if they were at the average income were $900, and the average young working family, their children were paying $7,200 due to our bizarre tax system, the way we treat retirements. And when they realized something extremely important, because we cannot criticize the elderly for feeling vulnerable in the event of a catastrophe. And what a lot of these people are worried about is that something untoward happens to them in their declining years. Well, under the affluence test that John and I and the Concord Coalition are supporting, we propose that the benefits not be cut for the poor and be cut progressively, annually, so that if you fall upon bad times, you will get whatever benefits are there. I happen to think that's an immensely important aspect of the problem. Now, I don't know whether you call this moral or what. The elderly in this country are immensely cynical about Washington, and they want to be damn sure that if their benefits are reduced, that somehow they haven't been singled out, and that everybody is included. Now, keep in mind that those of us that are over 65, and I'm in that category, went through the Second World War. And that's the last time I can remember when this country was genuinely united around a goal and the burden sharing was truly universal and fairly shared. We were all in it. My friend here, Vern, probably, I think you can remember this, right? There wasn't this question of whether it was fair or not. It's immensely important to solve this problem, that the elderly feel that the farmers are in it, and the veterans who are not disabled are in it, and the federal pensioners are in it, and everybody. And that's why we include in our affluence test all of these benefits, not just Social Security and retiree. And finally, the balanced budget. Many of us have been kidded about our desire for a balanced budget. It's partly for economic reasons, but it's also for political reasons. The elderly understand what a balanced budget is. They don't understand what 2.9% of the GNP and 38% of our gross private savings rate is. But they understand that if you have debts and deficits, the debts are going to be passed on to their children. So I think at the end of this show, Leslie said, all right, let's take a vote. And, you know, 60 minutes can be quite a needling exercise, particularly for fat cats like me. She fully expected 80-90% of these people to vote no on this plan. And much to her amazement, close to 90% voted yes. So I think the hopeful part of this is if we can somehow get the facts to the American people, and they think the plan will work, and that everybody's in it, and that it's moral, and those that fall into trouble get taken care of, I think we've got a pretty good shot at this situation. That's why the Concord Coalition, as Sandy has made entitlement reform its #1 project. And as John knows, we've decided to go about this in the same way that you'd go about any campaign. We're going to do focus groups. We're going to find out what people are afraid of. We're going to make up commercials. And we're going to try to figure out how to present this in a way that reassures people. But I think the moral question ultimately of the responsibilities of parents and grandchildren and grandparents to their own children and grandchildren, if we can avoid the fear that they have, will turn out to be a paramount issue in resolving this problem. But incidentally, I say to you, because it may be a couple of years before you graduate, I argue that young graduates at commencement addresses should have 2 careers, a private career and a public career. And I don't see any reason why you shouldn't get immensely active in this process, because it's your future we're talking about. And if you get yourself informed on the facts and talk to your parents and grandparents, and if you get out and vote and you get politically active, people are going to start listening to you. At the present time, you're seen as a pitiless pygmy almost, politically. And that's why we've supported, as he knows, a group called Lead or Leave, which put up a sign that had the rather indelicate phrase in front of the AARP saying, "You're screwing your own kids." Now, that isn't quite the way we would have put it, but nonetheless, the message was unambiguous, you know, and clear. There's a group, some people that have Harvard origins that you may have heard of, called the Third Millennium. And these young people are devoting their lives with college chapters and so forth. So a very important part of the answer relies on you getting the facts, communicating with your own parents and grandparents on the morality of what's going on, and then getting very active in the political process. The AARP, which paralyzes American politics, has 34 million members. They all pay dues, and Washington believes that, you know, they're the colossus that they can't ignore. Now, I couldn't resist the 60 Minutes audience to ask the members out there how many of them were AARP members. And they all put up their hands. I said, well, how can you be an AARP member and support my program? And they said, oh, they don't represent us. I said, why are you a member? And they said, well, we get discount drugs, and we get discount travel, and we get discount insurance, and we get discounts. It's kind of like a mail-order discount house. And I said, well, I wish Washington appreciated that fact. So I think the young are a very important part of the answer to your question. Excuse me for going on so long. Yeah.
Hello, my name's John Simon. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. And it seems to me what you're saying is to solve this problem, the sacrifice and the pain has to be shared, particularly intergenerationally. And I'm wondering if a plan that would say to the seniors, you're going to have to sacrifice by a cut of a point or two in the CPI adjustment to the baby boomers, the age is going to be moved up for people who are under 60 up 2 years, for people who are under 50 up 3 years. And then to people like myself say, you can opt out of Social Security, which is now a lot less attractive because your CPI is cut and your retirement age is moved up, but you'll have to pay to do that. And you'll have to continue to pay Social Security taxes for, say, 3 months for every year that you are under 50 until you've paid off your debt to your seniors, and then you're free. And you still have to have mandatory savings. You can't become a ward of the state once you retire, but provided you maintain a mandatory savings account with, similar to a 401k, you are have no more obligation to the Social Security or the FICA taxes.
On your first point, clearly there has to be some sacrifice. I don't know how much pain, but part of the political rhetoric that I find the most difficult is this nonsense we're hearing that all we have to do is reduce the growth of spending a little. What they don't tell you is that a big part of the budget are entitlements, which go up automatically, and the only way, quote, that you can do that is to cut the other programs dramatically, and in my position, unfairly. Now, your proposal is not unlike what I mentioned on Carrie Danforth with regard to young people. Namely, you have a mandated private savings plan. And we've asked our research people to figure out what the transitional costs are of doing that. You understand the current assumptions are that your payroll taxes are not going into savings. They're going in to pay for the benefits of the elderly. Now, by definition, your money is not going into the public trough, as it were. That's going to make the deficit problem that much worse because the revenues are going to fall. And that's why they wanted to start with a small amount and at the same time cut the benefits. I have a feeling that many thoughtful people, had they known that this is what was going to happen to these entitlement programs, would have started out with a privatized program. And the only reason we don't do it now is it's very hard to figure out how to transition. But I would encourage the Kennedy School to figure out what the transitional cost would be of a program of the type you're talking about. But I think it's a step very much in the same direction. And the other thing that would happen, I think, if you had to have a savings account, it would help change the culture, wouldn't it? Because you'd get a savings account, you'd see the appreciation, you would say, gee, savings isn't bad after all. So I think that is the appropriate direction. The question is how fast and how do we handle the transitional costs?
Hi. I'm Michael Watkins. I'm an assistant professor here at the Kennedy School, and I teach in the area of organizational change, so this is kind of an interesting problem from my point of view.
Dear me, I didn't know anybody would be here who knew what they were talking about. That one.
Well, I don't, and I think it's a particularly interesting problem because we teach our students that there's sort of two ways to approach change, and one is create a burning platform and hope that people jump off rather than stay and get burned, or try and find some kind of series of bridges from where you are to where you want to be. And you've described sort of two strategies, I think, that are potential bridges. One is a means testing kind of scenario.
I wish you wouldn't call it that, because means testing must be heard as mean, you see, and because it's heard as mean, then all of the advocates of these programs say, oh my God, you can't do that, it's going to destroy the program.
Okay, well,
that's why we say affluence
testing. Okay, affluence testing is one, and some kind of transition from this non-savings vehicle to a savings vehicle is the other. And I guess I just wonder what your current thinking is on how you create a coalition around one or both of those ideas.
Well, you're asking me, or I should be asking you. I gave you the challenge. One of the reasons I'm up here is this what I think universities ought to be doing, because those of us who've served in government, John has, knows that the long-term horizon can be defined as between now and the next presidential election. And I can assure you that the bureaucracies and the administration are not thinking seriously about this problem. I think you people should be putting such a program together, just to throw it back at you. But I think it's going to start out with some simple communication and education. My father was too far gone to really be able to have this kind of a dialogue, but like millions of other Americans, he honestly felt, deep down in his heart, that there was a savings account somewhere in Washington. and that the reason he was convinced of that is he had a Social Security number. And clearly, if he had a number and he had an account, the money must be there. And all he was doing was getting back his money. Now, if he really believes all those things, that it's his money and it's there, you can't blame people for thinking that it's theirs. So there has to be a huge educational effort. And if I could have a dream or a vision, it would include doing something that my good friend, whom I admire immensely, Jim Burke, used to be CEO of J&J, chairs the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. And they've done $300 million of commercials on drugs. And we have these mass communication techniques, and I think one of the things we have to explore is how do we use those techniques to educate the American people on the simple facts of the matter. I mean, as long as the politicians keep using words like trust funds, you know, it has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? I mean, I keep hearing Social Security, a trust fund won't run out until 2029. And as long as we have congressmen on my party, I'm ashamed to say, talking about repealing the tax on Social Security, which just increases the progressivity a little bit and moves in the direction of means testing, you know, what message does that send to the American people? If you think something is solvent until the year 2029 and your taxes can be cut, that's hardly a message that says there's a problem. So among the things I'd like to explore is how we use mass communication to try to educate the American people on this subject. Yes.
My name is Virginia Clay. I'm a pharmacist and a nurse and a master's student at the Harvard School of Public Health. I was wondering if you could say a little more about the group Third Millennium, and also I read in Business Week last week that Lead or Leave had lost their offices in D.C., and if you could say anything about that and any other relevant organizations working for intergenerational equity.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Lead or Leave people have a lot of debts, like everybody else. I was only going to make up some of them. But they also wanted to go to law school. And these are the young people that had the interesting idea of, they went to congressional candidates, you probably know, and got them to sign a pledge. And the pledge was, if the deficit was cut in half in 4 years, they could continue. And if it wasn't, they would leave. It was kind of an unambiguous approach to term limits, you know. And I don't know, they got 90 or 100, and I'm inclined to believe that they had quite an impact on some of these new congressmen who seem to be taking this issue quite seriously. Third Millennium are doing some first-rate, I think, work, John, intellectually on this subject. And they're using that to go out and set up chapters all over colleges in America, which I happen to think is a splendid idea. You mentioned health care, which we haven't talked about very much. And part of the beyond chutzpah, I guess you'd say, aspects of health care, and forgive me, John, you're joining this administration, but you recall the Clinton health care plan simply provided that you would have a whole new category of non-means tested entitlements. Long-term care for everyone, mental health, drugs, and early retirement, and what was the other one? There were,
Eyeglasses.
Yeah, there were 5 new entitlements, and this was in the name of cost control, which I found rather a stunning idea. Now, keep in mind that every health care entitlement that's ever been proposed was underestimated by somewhere between 7 and 20 to 1, because every new benefit creates new demand. So I asked my friend Rudman, I said, Rudman, I don't understand this. How can you possibly add 5 new entitlements and fund this extraordinary increase in demand with a cigarettes tax? And Rudman says, Peterson, I thought you were smarter than that. We're going to require everybody to smoke. And he said the cigarette revenues will be enormous, and people won't be around after the age of 85, and the health care costs will be reduced dramatically. Well, the thing that has not been told the American people yet is there are reasons that we spend 14% of the GNP on health care. And one reason is that we're very cost unconscious about health care. because we started Medicare and all these programs on kind of a cost-plus open basis. And if you're in the business, you know this. People come in for medical treatments partly as a social experience. It doesn't cost them anything. And part of what we have to do is make people far more conscious of the costs of health care. That's why we spend so terribly much on high-cost, high-tech, care. Medicare benefits, which are enormous, I mentioned, are tax-free. For the life of me, I do not understand why well-off people should be getting tax-free health care benefits. But it's another thing that makes us say, gee, it's easy. Corporations in America, Steve, I'm embarrassed to say it, Blackstone, we've been lucky enough to be successful. And the business strategy on benefits was very simple. The government's paying for 50% of it. Why don't we just come up with the most lavish plan we can? Why should there be an unlimited tax deduction for health care? What message does that send to the American people? You have this grotesque malpractice situation. Then there's this whole business of living wills. And this is another subject that I think would be interesting, fascinating for this school. Is there a way you could provide incentives for people to sign living wills? Because if you could, you'd dramatically reduce costs in the last few months of life. There's a fascinating study that says 89% of the Americans, when people explain a living will to them and the concept of it, think it's a good idea. But alas, only 9% of the people have signed one. So there's a host of things that have to be done to make health care, make us far more aware of why we're using so much high-tech, high-cost health care. And we're not telling the American people that they're going to have somewhat less than they have now. And I was very distressed with the Bush administration, frankly, to be bipartisan about it, when the state of Oregon did something that I think was quite courageous. The young man was asking, how do you make these decisions? They got the entire community together. And they got the unions and the doctors and the nurses and the religious people and so forth together. And they said, clearly, we can't afford everything we're now doing. And you probably know they ranked treatments from 1 to 720 or whatever it was, John, according to what it cost and what the benefit was. And they achieved a remarkable consensus that there were certain treatments that were simply inappropriate, which meant, you can call it whatever you want, rationing. Hell, we ration everything in life. But the American people aren't being told that. They're being told that you can raise little cigarette taxes and set up an agency and somehow slow the growth without telling them somebody's going to have to give up something. Yes.
My name is Brian Horrigan. I'm an economist and investment counseling firm downtown. I've noticed that Senators Nunn and Domenici and Representative Archer and a few other members of the new Congress have advanced proposals to replace the existing income tax structure with one variety of a consumption tax or another.
Right.
My questions for you is, first, are any of these politically feasible from your experience? And second, would this kind of transition solve some of these problems that we're speaking of here in terms of getting savings up and reducing intergenerational inequities?
Right. Well, I, for one, am very intrigued with the Nunn-Domenici approach, which is called, as you probably know, a progressive consumption tax. Maybe I've been living too long in America to believe that you could ignore progressivity. I think the whole notion, and I've experienced this as I talk to people, that somehow if you make more, you ought to pay more, has become a part of American life. And I think what they have proposed, as you know, is not taxing savings at all, but taxing consumption on a progressive basis to give people an incentive to consume less and save more. Now, I'm not a tax expert, you're the economist. There are some transitional problems there that have to be worked out. But I think that's a very promising area. The flat tax is something I don't yet fully understand because it depends so much on what the exemptions are. And I don't know what the effect on savings is exactly. And I'm, as you can hear, a nut on the subject of increasing savings. But I think the environment now for changing the tax system is far more benign than it's been in the last 20 years. And I think it is going to change in the next couple of years. Yes, definitely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Pete. That was terrific. Thanks very much. For those of you who are going to join us for dinner, we will go to the Fainside room, which is up here, one floor up. Thank you.